The Arizona sun blazed mercilessly over the Whitman ranch as Nalnish moved silently through the barn, her face concealed beneath the rough burlap sack that had become as much a part of her as the calloused hands that now carried feed buckets with practiced efficiency. The sack, stained with sweat and dust, had tiny holes worn through the fabric near her eyes, just enough to see where she walked, but never enough to let others see who she truly was. At 28, she had learned to make herself invisible in plain sight. The Whitman family had acquired her 3 years ago when her Apache band was relocated, speaking of her as though she were livestock, useful, but requiring management. The Indian girl, they called her, as if her name had been stripped away along with everything else. No one needs to know what she is, Eleanor Whitman had declared on that first day, fashioning the sack with her own hands. As long as she works and stays quiet, we won't have problems with the neighbors. So Nalnish had become a ghost in her own life, moving through each day unseen and unheard, tending horses, cleaning stalls, and maintaining the careful silence that kept her fed and housed. She had learned English by listening at doors and windows, but spoke only when directly questioned, her voice barely above a whisper. The Whitmans weren't cruel, merely practical. They provided basic shelter, simple food, and work that kept her hands busy and her mind numb. In exchange, she existed in a limbo between worlds, belonging fully to neither. This morning, like every morning for the past 3 years, she went about her tasks with mechanical precision. Feed the horses, muck the stalls, organize the tack room. The routine had become a meditation, a way to survive without truly living. But today felt different somehow. There was an unusual energy in the air, a sense of anticipation that she couldn't identify. Through the barn's open doors, she could see unusual activity around the main house. Eleanor Whitman directing the cleaning of rooms that were rarely used, and ranch hands discussing preparations for something important. As she worked, Nalnish found herself humming softly, an old Apache lullaby her grandmother had sung, one of the few memories she allowed herself to keep. The melody rose and fell like desert wind, carrying with it the echo of a time when she had been free to sing under open skies. She didn't realize she was being listened to until a shadow fell across the barn entrance. Through the small holes in her sack, she saw a figure silhouetted against the bright morning light, a tall man with broad shoulders, wearing the weathered clothes of someone who worked hard for his living. "Ma'am." The stranger's voice was gentle, respectful in a way she hadn't heard directed at her in years. "I'm sorry to interrupt. I'm looking for Samuel Whitman about purchasing some hay." Nalnish froze, her humming dying in her throat. She pointed toward the main house without speaking, as she had been trained to do, and moved to continue her work. "That was beautiful," the man said quietly. "The song. I haven't heard anything like it since—" He paused, and she sensed him studying her, taking in the strange sight of a woman working with her face hidden. "Since my late wife used to sing to our children." Something in his tone made her look up, really look, for the first time in months. Through the fabric, she could make out kind brown eyes in a weathered face, graying hair beneath a worn hat, and hands that bore the honest calluses of ranch work. He was perhaps 40, with the steady bearing of a man who had known both joy and sorrow. "Thomas Brennan," he introduced himself with a slight tip of his hat. "I have a spread about 10 miles north of here." She nodded acknowledgement but said nothing. Experience had taught her that conversations with strangers led to questions she wasn't allowed to answer. "Well," Thomas said after a moment of silence that seemed somehow comfortable rather than awkward, "I should go find Mr. Whitman about that hay." As he walked toward the house, Nalnish found herself watching his retreating figure with curious interest. Something about his manner, the way he had spoken to her as though she were a real person rather than a useful object, had stirred something in her chest that she had thought permanently buried. 20 minutes later, she heard voices approaching the barn, Samuel Whitman's familiar gruff tones mixed with the stranger's quieter responses. They were discussing hay prices and delivery schedules, but Nalnish found herself listening for something else entirely. "The woman in your barn," she heard Thomas say as they examined the hay bales. Is she all right?" "The Indian?" Samuel's voice carried its usual dismissive tone. "She's fine. Works hard, causes no trouble. We keep her face covered to avoid complications with the neighbors, you understand." "Complications? Some folks around here have strong feelings about Indians." This way she can work without causing problems for anyone. Practical solution to a practical problem. There was a long pause. When Thomas spoke again, his voice carried a hardness that hadn't been there before. I see. After they concluded their business and Thomas had arranged for hay delivery the following week, Nalnish heard his horse's hoofbeats departing. But something had changed in the barn's atmosphere, as though the brief encounter had shifted some invisible balance. For the first time in 3 years, as she completed her afternoon tasks, Nalnish found herself wondering what it might feel like to be seen, really seen, by another human being. The thought was both thrilling and terrifying. She didn't know that 10 miles away, Thomas Brennan was having similar thoughts as he rode home to his empty house, haunted by the memory of a beautiful voice emerging from burlap, darkness and the terrible wrongness of a human being forced to hide her face from the world. Neither of them could have predicted that their brief encounter would set in, motion events that would change both their lives forever. But, in the silence of the Arizona desert, under stars that had witnessed countless stories of human courage and cruelty, the first threads of an extraordinary tale were already beginning to weave together. Thomas Brennan's ranch sat nestled in a valley surrounded by red rock formations that caught fire in the morning and evening light. It was a modest spread, enough to support a small herd of cattle and provide a living for a man who had learned to find contentment in simple things. The house, built with his own hands 10 years ago, had been designed with a woman's touch and children's laughter in mind. Now it stood eerily quiet. As he unsaddled his horse in the fading light, Thomas found himself humming the melody he had heard that morning. The Apache woman's song had awakened memories he had carefully buried 3 years ago, when fever took his wife Catherine and their twin daughters, ages 6 and 4. Catherine had sung similar haunting melodies while she worked, Irish ballads learned from her grandmother, lullabies that could soothe the wildest colt or the most restless child. The song from the barn had the same quality of ancient sorrow mixed with stubborn hope. Thomas walked slowly to the small cemetery plot behind his house, where 3 simple wooden crosses marked the graves of his family. He had built this place as a sanctuary, but it had become a monument to loss instead. Every evening for 3 years he had come here to speak to them, to maintain the connection that death had tried to sever. Met someone today? Catherine, he said quietly, settling onto the wooden bench he had built facing the graves. An Apache woman. Someone's treating her. He struggled for words, like she's not human. The wind stirred through the mesquite trees, and Thomas could almost hear Catherine's voice in his memory. She had always been fierce about fairness, about treating people with dignity regardless of their circumstances. She would have been outraged by what he had witnessed at the Whitman Ranch. She was singing, Cat. Beautiful voice like yours. But they keep her face covered with a sack. His hands clenched into fists. A sack, like she's something shameful to be hidden. The more he thought about it, the angrier he became. Not the explosive anger that led to violence, but the slow-burning fury that demanded action. He had seen enough cruelty during the war. Enough of humanity's capacity for treating other humans as less than human. Coming home to Arizona, he had hoped to leave such darkness behind. I don't know why it matters so much to me, he continued, watching the first stars appear in the deepening sky. Maybe because we both know what it's like to lose everything. Maybe because no one should have to live without their face, without their name, without their voice. A coyote howled in the distance, and Thomas felt a familiar stab of loneliness. For 3 years he had convinced himself that solitude was enough, that work and routine could fill the emptiness left by loss. But hearing that woman's song had reminded him of something he had forgotten. That human connection was what made life worth living. What would you do, Cat? He asked the gathering darkness. What would you tell me to do? The answer came not in words, but in memory. Catherine defending a Mexican family from harassment in town. Catherine insisting they hire an aging ranch hand when other employers had turned him away. Catherine treating everyone with the same fierce kindness regardless of their station in life. Catherine would have done something. She would have found a way. Thomas sat in contemplation until the desert cold drove him inside. His house felt larger and emptier than usual, as he prepared a simple meal and tried to lose himself in ranch ledgers and supply catalogs. But his mind kept returning to the image of a woman forced to hide her face, reduced to nothing more than useful hands and silent obedience. By the time he went to bed, a plan was beginning to form in his mind. It was audacious, possibly foolish, and certainly complicated. But it was also right in a way that felt as clear and certain as sunrise. The next morning, Thomas rose before dawn and spent extra time preparing himself. He shaved carefully, selected his best shirt, and polished his boots until they gleamed. If he was going to do this, he would do it with all the dignity and respect the situation demanded. As he rode toward the Whitman ranch, his heart pounded with a mixture of nervousness and determination. He was about to take a step that would change two lives forever, his own, and that of a woman whose name he didn't even know yet. The sun was climbing higher when he reached the Whitman property, and he could see activity around the main house and outbuildings. Ranch hands going about their morning tasks, cattle being moved to fresh pasture, the normal rhythm of a working spread. But his attention was focused entirely on the barn, where he knew he would find the woman whose voice had haunted his dreams. This time he wasn't coming to buy hay. This time he was coming to offer something far more precious: freedom, dignity, and the chance to be seen as a complete human being for the first time in years. Thomas had no idea if she would accept his offer, or if the Whitmans would even allow him to make it. But as he dismounted and walked toward the barn with measured steps, he knew with absolute certainty that he had to try. Some things were worth the risk of looking foolish. Some things were worth the risk of having your heart broken again. And sometimes, the most important decisions were made not with the head, but with the part of the soul that recognized kindred spirits across the vast loneliness of human existence. Today, Thomas Brennan was betting everything on that recognition. Nalnish was mucking stalls when she heard familiar hoofbeats approaching the barn, her hands stilled on the pitchfork handle as she recognized the measured gait of the same horse that had visited the day before. Through the small holes in her sack, she watched Thomas Brennan dismount with the same careful deliberation she remembered. But today was different. Today he walked directly toward the barn instead of the main house, his boots clicking with determined purpose on the hard-packed earth. "Ma'am," he said, removing his hat as he entered the shadowy interior, "I was hoping to speak with you." Nalnish set down her pitchfork and stood silently, uncertain how to respond. In 3 years at the Whitman ranch, no visitor had ever sought her out for conversation. Thomas seemed to understand her confusion. "I know this is unusual, but I have something important to ask you, and I believe you have the right to hear it directly." She tilted her head slightly, the burlap rustling with the movement. "My name is Thomas Brennan, as I mentioned yesterday. I own a ranch about 10 miles north of here." He paused, seeming to gather his thoughts. "I lost my wife and children 3 years ago to fever. Since then I've been living alone, and I've been thinking that maybe that's not the best way to live." Nalnish remained motionless, but her heart began beating faster. She had learned to read voices, to detect the subtle variations in tone that revealed true intentions. This man's voice carried sincerity, but also nervousness and something else. Hope, perhaps. "What I'm about to suggest may sound strange," Thomas continued, "but I believe it could benefit both of us. I'm offering you marriage, a real marriage with respect and partnership. You would have your own room, your own space, and most importantly, your own choice about how to live." The pitchfork slipped from her nerveless fingers and clattered to the barn floor. Marriage to this stranger? The concept seemed impossible to grasp. "I know you don't know me," Thomas said quickly, interpreting her silence as rejection. "But I give you my word that I would treat you with honor. You would have freedom to be yourself, to use your real name, to show your face to the world. No one would ever force you to hide again." For the first time in years, Nalnish found her voice. It came out as barely a whisper, rusty from disuse. "Why? Because what they're doing to you is wrong," Thomas replied simply. "Because every person deserves to be seen and valued for who they are, because—" He hesitated, then continued with quiet honesty, "Because I heard you singing yesterday, and it reminded me that there's still beauty in the world worth protecting." Nalnish felt tears welling up behind the burlap, tears she hadn't allowed herself to shed since the day they first covered her face. "You don't know what I look like," she whispered. "I know what you sound like," Thomas replied. "I know you're gentle with the horses, careful with your work, and that you carry yourself with dignity despite everything you've endured. That tells me more about who you are than any face ever could. The Whitmans, they won't just let me go. They will if you're married to me. By law, you'd be my responsibility then, not theirs." Thomas's voice grew firmer. "They can't keep you as a servant if you're my wife. The word wife hung in the air between them like something fragile and precious. Nalnish had never imagined such a possibility. In her old life, before the relocation, she had sometimes dreamed of marriage and children. But those dreams had died along with her freedom. "What would you want from me?" she asked, her voice growing stronger. "Companionship," Thomas replied honestly. "Someone to share meals with, to talk to in the evenings, to help make a house feel like a home again. Nothing you weren't willing to give freely. And if I can't be what you need, then we figure it out together day by day. No promises except mutual respect and the chance to build something better than what either of us has now." Nalnish was quiet for a long time, her mind racing. It was the most incredible offer anyone had ever made her. Freedom, dignity, the chance to have a name again. But it was also terrifying. She had spent 3 years learning to be invisible, to want nothing, to expect nothing. Could I think about it?" she asked finally. "Of course. But I should tell you, I plan to speak with the Whitmans today either way. What they're doing to you isn't right regardless of your decision. Don't," she said urgently. "Please, if you make them angry and I refuse your offer, they might—" She didn't finish the sentence, but Thomas understood. "All right," he agreed. "I'll wait for your answer first. But I won't wait long. Some situations require action, and this is one of them." As Thomas prepared to leave, he paused at the barn entrance. "What's your real name?" he asked quietly. For a moment, Nalnish couldn't speak. It had been so long since anyone had asked, so long since she had been allowed to claim her own identity. "Nalnish," she whispered finally. "It means she is working in my language." "Nalnish," Thomas repeated, his voice gentle and respectful. "It's beautiful. Like you're singing." After he left, Nalnish sank onto a bale of hay, her hands trembling as she pulled the rough burlap away from her face for just a moment, something she never dared do during daylight. The cool air on her skin felt like freedom itself. For the first time in 3 years, she allowed herself to imagine a different life. A life where she could speak her own name, show her own face, make her own choices. It was the most terrifying and wonderful thought she had ever dared to have. Outside, she could hear the normal sounds of the ranch continuing around her. Horses whinnying, men calling to each other, the distant sound of cattle. But inside the barn, everything had changed. Thomas Brennan had offered her something she had thought lost forever, the chance to be human again. The question was, did she have the courage to take it? That evening, Nalnish lay on her narrow cot in the tiny room behind the kitchen that served as her quarters. The space was barely large enough for a bed and a single wooden box that held her few possessions. But it was private, the only place where she could safely remove the sack from her head. By candlelight, she examined her reflection in a small piece of polished metal she had found years ago and secretly kept. The face that looked back was older than she remembered, marked by years of hidden sorrow, but still recognizably her own. High cheekbones, dark eyes that had learned to see through fabric, lips that had almost forgotten how to smile. She tried to imagine what Thomas Brennan would think when he saw her fully. Would he have second thoughts? Would he regret his generous offer once the reality of who and what she was became undeniable? But even as these fears crowded her mind, she found herself remembering his voice, the genuine respect in it, the way he had said her name as though it mattered. When had anyone last treated her as though she mattered? A soft knock on her door interrupted her thoughts. "Girl," came Eleanor Whitman's voice. "Are you decent?" Nalnish quickly pulled the sack over her head and opened the door. Eleanor stood in the hallway holding a cup of coffee, an unusual kindness that immediately put Nalnish on alert. "May I come in?" Nalnish nodded and stepped aside. Eleanor entered the small space, her eyes taking in the sparse furnishings with satisfaction. She had always been pleased that the Indian girl required so little maintenance. "I wanted to speak with you about Mr. Brennan," Eleanor said, settling herself on the single chair. "He seemed quite interested in you today." Nalnish remained standing, uncertain where this conversation was leading. "Has he made you any offers?" Eleanor's voice carried a sharp edge of suspicion. The question hung in the air. Nalnish realized this was a crucial moment. Her answer could determine not only her own future but possibly Thomas's safety as well. If Eleanor suspected what Thomas was planning, she might take steps to prevent it. "He asked about my work," Nalnish said carefully, keeping her voice neutral.
Whether I was content, Eleanor's eyes narrowed.
And what did you tell him? That I do my job. Good. Eleanor relaxed slightly. Because I want to be very clear about something, girl. You have a place here as long as you remember what you are and where you belong. Men like Brennan sometimes get ideas, charitable ideas that aren't practical for anyone involved. Do you understand what I'm saying? Nalnish understood perfectly. Eleanor was warning her away from any thoughts of escape, any dreams of a different life. The message was clear. Accept your lot or risk losing even what little security you have. I understand, Mrs. Whitman. I thought you might. Eleanor stood to leave, then paused at the door. It would be unfortunate if anyone got hurt because of unrealistic expectations. Very unfortunate indeed. After Eleanor left, Nalnish sank onto her cot, her whole body trembling. The threat had been subtle but unmistakable. If she tried to leave with Thomas, there could be consequences, perhaps for both of them. But as she sat in the flickering candlelight, another realization dawned on her. Eleanor's warning revealed fear that Nalnish might actually have a choice, that someone might actually value her enough to offer her a way out. That fear meant Eleanor knew exactly how wrong her treatment of Nalnish had been all along. The next morning dawned clear and bright, and Nalnish went about her usual tasks with unusual energy. She had made her decision during the long, sleepless night, and now she felt both terrified and exhilarated by her own daring. When she heard Thomas's horse approaching around mid-morning, her heart began racing. This time she didn't wait for him to find her. She walked out of the barn to meet him. Mr. Brennan, she said, her voice stronger than it had been the day before. Miss Nalnish, he replied, dismounting with the same respectful manner she remembered. Have you had time to consider my offer? Yes. She paused, gathering her courage for what might be the most important words she had ever spoken. Yes, I accept. I want to be your wife. The smile that spread across Thomas's weathered face was like sunrise over the desert. Are you certain? Once we do this, there's no going back. I'm certain. Thomas nodded decisively. Then we do this properly. Will you walk with me to the main house? As they approached the Whitman homestead, Nalnish felt her courage wavering. What if the Whitmans refused? What if they found a way to stop her? What if Thomas seemed to sense her fear? Whatever happens, he said quietly, remember that you have value. You have worth. Don't let anyone make you forget that again. Samuel Whitman emerged from the house as they approached, his expression shifting from surprise to suspicion as he took in the sight of his Indian girl, walking beside the visiting rancher like an equal. Brennan, he said cautiously. What can I do for you? Thomas straightened to his full height, his voice carrying the authority of a man accustomed to being heard. I've come to ask for this woman's hand in marriage, Mr. Whitman. I'm prepared to offer you fair compensation for any inconvenience. The silence that followed was absolute. Samuel's mouth actually fell open, while Eleanor appeared in the doorway, her face a mask of shocked outrage. You want to marry her? Eleanor's voice was shrill with disbelief. She's an Indian. She's a servant. She's a woman, Thomas replied calmly, and she's agreed to become my wife. I believe that makes this a legal matter now. And with those words, everything changed. The careful balance of power that had kept Nalnish trapped for 3 years suddenly shifted, and for the first time since she could remember, she felt hope blooming in her chest like desert flowers after rain. The hardest part was yet to come, but she was no longer facing it alone. The standoff on the Whitman porch stretched taut as a bowstring, with 4 lives hanging in the balance of what would happen next. Samuel Whitman's face had gone from surprise to calculation, his merchant's mind already weighing the implications of Thomas's proposal. Now, hold on just a minute, Samuel said, raising his hands. This is highly irregular, Brennan. We have legal agreements about the girl's situation. What kind of legal agreements? Thomas's voice carried the steel of a man who had dealt with enough bureaucracy during his cavalry days to know when someone was bluffing. Samuel's mouth worked silently for a moment before Eleanor stepped forward, her face flushed with indignation. She's bound to us by territorial law. Indians placed with white families for their own protection and civilization. You can't just take her. Can't I? Thomas reached into his vest pocket and withdrew a folded document. This is a marriage license properly filed with the territorial courthouse yesterday. All it needs is signatures and witnesses. Nalnish stared at the paper in amazement. He had been that confident in her answer, or that determined to help her regardless of the risks. Furthermore, Thomas continued, I've consulted with a lawyer in Tucson. Any indenture or service agreement becomes void upon marriage. It's federal law. Samuel and Eleanor exchanged worried glances. Whatever arrangement they had believed protected their hold over Nalnish was crumbling before their eyes. She's not suitable for marriage to a respectable man, Eleanor sputtered. Look at her. We keep her face covered for good reason. Then perhaps it's time we all saw what that reason really is, Thomas said quietly. He turned to Nalnish, his eyes kind but determined. With your permission, Miss Nalnish, I think it's time you showed your face to the world. This was the moment Nalnish had dreaded and longed for in equal measure. For 3 years, the sack had been both prison and protection, hiding her from the world's judgment but also from its recognition of her humanity. With trembling hands, she reached up to the rough burlap that had become like a second skin. The fabric felt heavier than it ever had as she slowly lifted it over her head and let it fall to the porch boards. The afternoon sun fell across her face for the first time in years, warm and bright and wonderful. She blinked against the unfiltered light, her eyes adjusting to seeing the world in full color and sharp detail again. Samuel Whitman took an involuntary step backward. Eleanor's hand flew to her throat in surprise. Thomas, however, stepped closer, his expression one of quiet admiration. You're beautiful, he said simply, and Nalnish felt tears starting in her eyes. Tears of relief, of gratitude, of hope too long denied. She was beautiful, not in the delicate, pale way that white society prized, but with the strong, clean features of her Apache heritage. High cheekbones caught the light like carved stone. Her dark eyes held depths that spoke of wisdom earned through hardship, and her black hair, braided simply, fell past her shoulders like polished obsidian. This changes nothing, Eleanor said, but her voice lacked its earlier conviction. She's still what she is. Yes, she is, Thomas agreed. She's a woman of strength, intelligence, and dignity. She's exactly what she should be, herself. He offered his arm to Nalnish with the same courtesy he might show any lady. Shall we proceed with the ceremony? Ceremony? Samuel found his voice again. Now here? I took the liberty of asking Reverend Martinez to meet us here this afternoon, Thomas explained. He should be arriving any moment. As if summoned by his words, the sound of an approaching wagon reached their ears. A small, elderly Mexican priest climbed down from the driver's seat, carrying a worn leather Bible and wearing the patient expression of a man accustomed to being called upon in unusual circumstances. Senor Brennan, Reverend Martinez said with a slight bow, I am here as requested. These are the ones to be married? If the lady is still willing, Thomas replied, looking at Nalnish with questioning eyes, standing there in the full light of day, her face uncovered, her hair stirring in the desert breeze. Nalnish felt more alive than she had in years. The woman who had hidden in shadows was gone, replaced by someone who could choose her own destiny. I'm willing, she said, and her voice carried clearly across the porch for everyone to hear. But this is absurd, Eleanor protested. Samuel, do something. Samuel, however, was looking at the marriage license in Thomas's hand, with the expression of a man who recognized legal inevitability when he saw it. What compensation did you have in mind? He asked reluctantly. Thomas named a sum that made Samuel's eyebrows rise, more than generous for the loss of a servant, but a fair price for 3 years of stolen freedom. Very well, Samuel said with poor grace. But don't come crying to us when this arrangement doesn't work out the way you expect. I won't, Thomas assured him. Then turning to Nalnish, are you ready? She looked around the porch where she had spent so many hours scrubbing and cleaning, at the barn where she had hidden her voice and her face, at the Whitmans who had given her shelter at the cost of her identity. Then she looked at Thomas, at the kindness in his eyes, the respect in his manner, the promise of a life where she could be fully herself. I'm ready, she said. As Reverend Martinez opened his Bible and began to speak the words that would join their lives together, Nalnish felt the desert wind on her uncovered face and knew that she was finally, truly free. The ceremony was simple, witnessed by people who ranged from reluctant to hostile. But when Thomas placed a simple silver ring on her finger and spoke the words, I take you as my wife, Nalnish felt as though she was being reborn, And when the Reverend pronounced them married and Thomas gently lifted her hand to his lips in the traditional kiss, she realized that sometimes salvation came not from God or government or the kindness of strangers, but from the simple courage of one person willing to see another's full humanity. As they walked toward Thomas's horse, leaving the Whitman ranch behind forever, Nalnish took one last look back at the burlap sack lying abandoned on the porch boards. Let it lie there, she thought. Let it rot in the desert sun. She had a name again. She had a face again. And most miraculous of all, she had hope again. Whatever challenges lay ahead, she would meet them as herself, finally and completely herself. The ride to Thomas's ranch took them through some of the most beautiful country Nalnish had ever seen, and for the first time in 3 years, she could see it all clearly. Red rock formations rose like ancient cathedrals from the desert floor, their surfaces painted in shades of crimson and gold by the afternoon sun. Saguaro cacti stood like sentinels against the vast blue sky, and in the distance, mountains rose purple and mysterious. It's beautiful, she breathed, turning her face up to the sun without fear of who might see her. It is, Thomas agreed, but when she looked at him, he was watching her rather than the landscape. I'd forgotten how beautiful it could be when you have someone to share it with. They rode mostly in comfortable silence, both adjusting to the momentous change that had occurred in their lives over the span of a few hours. Nalnish found herself stealing glances at her new husband, trying to reconcile this gentle, determined man with the lonely widower who had made such an extraordinary offer to a stranger. As they crested a hill, Thomas's ranch came into view below them. It was modest but well-maintained. A single-story adobe house with a wide porch, several outbuildings and corrals that held a small herd of horses. The land stretched out in all directions, bounded by natural rock formations that provided both beauty and practical wind protection. It's not grand, Thomas said, perhaps misreading her silence as disappointment. But it's solid and it's ours now. Ours, Nalnish repeated wonderingly. The concept of ownership, of belonging somewhere by right rather than sufferance, felt foreign and thrilling. As they approached the house, Thomas dismounted and came around to help her down from his horse. His hands were gentle but respectful as he assisted her, treating her with the courtesy due a wife rather than the casual handling she had grown accustomed to. Would you like to see the house? He asked, suddenly seeming shy. I should warn you, it's been a bachelor's home for 3 years. It could use a woman's touch. Nalnish followed him up the porch steps, noting the solid construction and thoughtful details. A bench positioned to catch the morning sun, wind chimes that sang softly in the desert breeze, a wooden rocking chair that spoke of evenings spent in quiet contemplation. The interior was indeed sparse but clean. The main room served as both kitchen and living area, with a stone fireplace, simple wooden furniture, and windows positioned to catch both light and cross breezes. Everything was functional but lacking warmth, the home of a man who had been surviving rather than living. The bedroom is there, Thomas said, gesturing toward a doorway, then quickly adding, but I prepared the spare room for you. I want you to feel comfortable here, to have your own space until we both know where we stand. His thoughtfulness touched her deeply. After years of having no privacy, no choices, the idea of her own room felt like luxury beyond imagination. And this, Thomas continued, leading her to another door, it was meant to be the children's room. The room beyond was empty except for a few pieces of child-sized furniture pushed against one wall, remnants of dreams interrupted by tragedy. Nalnish could see the pain in Thomas's face as he looked at those abandoned toys and tiny chairs. We can close this room, he said quietly, or you can use it for whatever you'd like. It's your house now, too. Nalnish walked to the window and looked out at the vast expanse of desert and sky. Could I use it for working? Maybe weaving? I remember how from before. Thomas's face brightened. Of course. Whatever you need, we can get. Looms, materials, anything. As the sun began to set, Thomas prepared a simple meal while Nalnish explored her new surroundings with wonder. Everything was hers to touch, to examine, to use without permission. The sensation was overwhelming. Over dinner, eaten at a real table with real plates as equals, they talked hesitantly about practical matters. How the ranch operated, what her role might be, how they would navigate this strange new partnership. I don't expect you to become someone you're not, Thomas said as they finished eating. "I hope you know that. You've spent 3 years being forced to hide who you are. Here, I want you to discover who you really are." "I'm not sure I remember," Nalnish admitted. "It's been so long since I was allowed to be myself that I'm not certain who that person is anymore." "Then we'll find out together," Thomas replied. No hurry, no pressure, just discovery. That evening, as Nalnish settled into her own room, her own bed, with clean sheets and a window she could open or close as she chose, she felt a peace she had almost forgotten existed. For the first time in years, she didn't have to hide her face, moderate her voice, or measure every movement against someone else's approval. Through the thin walls, she could hear Thomas moving about the house, banking the fire, checking the locks, performing the nightly rituals of a man protecting what was his. But the sounds were comforting rather than threatening, the sounds of someone keeping her safe rather than keeping her prisoner. As she drifted toward sleep, Nalnish found herself humming again, not the careful, hidden melodies she had whispered in the Whitman barn, but full-throated songs from her childhood that filled the room with music. If Thomas heard her singing through the walls, he gave no sign of it. But in his own room he smiled as he recognized the same haunting beauty that had first called to him across a dusty barnyard and changed both their lives forever. Outside, coyotes sang to the desert moon, and the vast Arizona sky sparkled with more stars than either of them had noticed in years. It was the beginning of something neither could yet name, not quite love, but something deeper than mere convenience or charity. It was the beginning of two wounded souls learning to heal together, to build something new from the ruins of what they had lost. And in the morning, when the sun rose over the red rocks and painted the desert in shades of hope, they would begin the real work of discovering who they could become together. 3 months later, Nalnish stood at her loom in what had once been the children's room, weaving a blanket with patterns that told the story of desert storms and sudden blooms. Her hands moved with the remembered skill of her grandmother's teachings, creating something beautiful from simple materials, much like what she and Thomas were doing with their lives. The marriage had grown easier with each passing day, built on small kindnesses and mutual respect rather than grand gestures or passionate declarations. Thomas had proven to be exactly what he had promised: respectful, patient, and genuinely interested in her thoughts and opinions. He consulted her about ranch decisions, listened to her suggestions about the house, and never once made her feel like a burden or an obligation. In return, Nalnish had slowly emerged from the shell of enforced silence that had protected her for so long. She cooked meals that blended her Apache heritage with practical frontier fare. She tended a garden that produced both familiar desert plants and vegetables Thomas had never tasted. Most importantly, she filled the house with music, singing while she worked, humming while she cooked, bringing life back to rooms that had been silent too long. "Nalnish?" Thomas's voice called from the main room. "We have visitors coming." She set down her shuttle and moved to the window. In the distance, a small group of riders approached, 3 men she didn't recognize, riding with the purposeful pace of people on official business. When she joined Thomas on the porch, she could see the tension in his shoulders. "Do you know them?" "The one in front is Marshall Davies from Tucson," Thomas replied quietly. "I'm not sure why he's here, but it's probably not a social call." As the riders drew closer, Nalnish felt a familiar knot of fear in her stomach. In her experience, official visits rarely brought good news for people like her. Marshall Davies was a tall, lean man with graying hair and the watchful eyes of someone accustomed to trouble. His companions looked like deputies, young men with serious faces and well-maintained weapons. Thomas Brennan. Davies dismounted and approached the porch with formal courtesy. "I'm Marshall Davies. We need to have a word with you and your wife." The slight hesitation before wife made Nalnish's blood run cold, but Thomas stepped forward calmly. "Of course, Marshall. What's this about?" "We've received complaints about your marriage," Davies said, consulting a small notebook. "Questions about its legality, concerns about proper procedures. From whom?" Thomas's voice carried a dangerous edge. "The Whitman family has filed a complaint claiming you coerced their employee into an illegal union. They're demanding her return and your arrest for theft of services." Nalnish felt the world tilting around her. After 3 months of freedom, of growing into herself, the thought of being dragged back to the Whitmans was unbearable. But Thomas stepped protectively in front of her, his voice steady and strong. "Marshal, I have all the proper documentation. The marriage was performed by a licensed minister, witnessed and filed with the territorial government. My wife was free to choose, and she chose freely." "That's what we're here to determine," Davies replied. "Mrs. Brennan, I need to ask you some questions directly." The use of her married name, her real name, gave Nalnish strength. She stepped forward, standing beside Thomas rather than behind him. "I'll answer your questions, Marshal. Were you coerced in any way into this marriage?" "No, sir. Mr. Brennan offered me a choice. I made it freely. Did you understand the implications of your decision?" "Yes, sir. I understood that I would be free to show my face, use my name, and make my own decisions. That was exactly what I wanted." Davies studied her carefully. "The Whitmans claim you were bound to them by legal indenture. They say you had no right to marry without their consent." "The Whitmans never had any legal papers," Thomas interjected. "I had a lawyer research this thoroughly. Whatever arrangement they claimed was informal at best, illegal at worst. Nevertheless," Davies continued, "they're demanding compensation for the loss of your services and claiming the marriage should be annulled." "No." The word came out of Nalnish with surprising force. "No, I won't go back. I'm not property to be returned or compensation to be paid. I'm a married woman with rights under the law." One of the deputies shifted uncomfortably. "Ma'am, the Whitmans have connections, important friends. This could get complicated for you and your husband." "Let it get complicated," Thomas said firmly. "My wife and I have done nothing wrong, and we're not going to be bullied by people who want to treat human beings like livestock." Marshal Davies closed his notebook and looked at both of them for a long moment. "I'll be honest with you folks. The law is on your side as far as I can tell, but the Whitmans have political influence and they're not going to let this go easily." "What do you recommend?" Thomas asked. "Document everything. Keep copies of all your marriage papers, witnesses who can testify to the circumstances, and be prepared for more visits like this one." Davies remounted his horse. "For what it's worth, I think you did the right thing. But doing the right thing and avoiding trouble aren't always the same thing in this territory." After the marshal and his men rode away, Thomas and Nalnish stood together on their porch watching the dust settle in their wake. The afternoon sun was still warm, the desert still beautiful, but the shadow of potential trouble now hung over their peaceful valley. "Are you sorry?" Thomas asked quietly. "Sorry you chose this path?" Nalnish took his hand, rough from ranch work but gentle in hers. "I'm not sorry," she said firmly. "For the first time in years, I'm exactly where I want to be, with exactly who I want to be with." Thomas squeezed her fingers. "Whatever comes next, we face it together." "Together," she agreed. As the sun set over their ranch, painting the sky in brilliant shades of orange and purple, Thomas and Nalnish stood united against whatever challenges the future might bring. Their marriage had begun as an act of mutual rescue, but it was growing into something deeper, a partnership built on respect, trust, and the gradual recognition that they were better together than either had ever been alone. The Whitmans might have power and influence, but Thomas and Nalnish had something stronger, the unshakable conviction that their love, for it was love now, growing quietly but surely between them, was worth fighting for. And in the Arizona desert, under a sky full of stars, that conviction would have to be enough to see them through whatever storms lay ahead.